say that I need to be saved. Say with me, the devil got his way. I want to know how when you are praying, when you are doomsdaying, how you think you know that someone is listening to what you are saying. So you think that you can tell us how to live our life, never questioning the source from which your moral code derives. You think that suffering is part of some great plan that's been devised. I wonder when we'll be rid of your life.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Open Air Atheist Podcast. This is episode 19. I'm your host, James Theodore Stowell III. And this episode is going to be pretty lengthy, so I got to warn you. It's going to be the longest one thus far. And basically what I'm going to be doing is playing a conversation that I had January 28th, 2011. And it was, the conversation consists of me and a British Christian philosopher by the name of TheCartesianTheist. He's a YouTube theist, apologist. So we had this lengthy conversation about a video that I did called For God So Loved the World. It's actually a series of 3 videos. And the one in contention that we were discussing was For God So Loved the World Part 1, where the main focus of that video was to show that John 3:16 does not necessarily teach that this biblical God character loves every single person, past, present, and future. And I'm sure most of you can quote the English version, For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Then you look in your more literal translations, like your interlinear translations, and you hear translations like this: For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that everyone believing into him should not perish but have everlasting life. The word there in contention that I have a big issue with is when they translate pas, that's in the singular, whosoever. And Cartesian theists will argue there's not really much of a difference between pas and between every or everyone and whosoever. I think there is, because I think it's a misleading translation because of how the majority of Christians use that verse nowadays. They'll, hold up this verse and say, whosoever, see, whosoever, just draw your name in the blank and, say this little prayer and God will save you. But this is not the theology that the New Testament writers espoused. As I was trying to show in my 3-part series, For God So Loved the World. So what I was trying to do is show that, no, first of all, this verse, John 3:16, is apexegetical, which means that it is not meant to be quoted by itself. It's really an explanation of the verses prior to it, verses 14 and 15. Let me read that to you real quick. And even as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that everyone believing into him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I think it's more clear in the original language when you look at this passage here, that the emphasis is not on God loving the world, but the emphasis is on a life of persevering faith. The word translated believing is pisteuon, and it's a present active indicative. Also note that right in between, sandwiched in between pas and the word believing, pisteuon, there is a definite article there. So really it would be that the believing ones. Okay, so it doesn't make sense in English because I'm reading it in its Greek order. But there is a particular the believing ones that John is referring here to. These people constantly exercising this type of God-given faith. Okay, so this isn't just I believe based on evidence, or this is a God-granted kind of spiritual faith, if you will. So, and I think that I made that pretty clear in that 3-part series. So, I was basically trying to show that John 3:16 is not talking at all about God loving every person, past, present, and future. So what I went on and did is I showed a couple different ways in which the word cosmos is used, not only by the author John, but also by Peter. And in doing this, all I was trying to show was that the word cosmos does not necessarily mean every single person, past, present, and future. The word translated world is not talking about every human being ever born. It's talking, it all depends on how the author is using it and the context. And that's all that I was really trying to show in that first part of the series. So, Christians, or at least the average Christian nowadays, loves to quote verses like John 3:16 and says, see, look, here, God loves everybody. And he's, basically weeping over the banisters of heaven, just hoping you'll come to him. But this is not the theology of the New Testament authors. I would say that the New Testament authors took a lot from Stoicism, in the sense that, for instance, the Stoics believed in the divine logos, and the Christians took that, or at least I should say the author John took that. And if you read the beginning of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, which is the word logos. They translate it word. I think, at least it's one of my theories, that they may have stole that from the Stoics and tried to anthropomorphize the Stoics, or the Stoics logos, by calling it Jesus, by saying, oh, this is Jesus. Now, I could be wrong. It's just a theory. But I do see a lot of similarities with the Stoic deterministic theology and their whole idea of providence and determinism. Then also, try to factor in the fact that Stoicism was pretty popular in the Roman Empire at that time when these letters were being written. So I could see how these writers could be influenced by some Stoic deterministic theology. Then, but it's just a theory, and I'm sure I could hear Dr. James White say something like, "Oh, were you saying that these monotheistic Jews who were just utterly repulsed by any kind of paganism, and yet you're going to claim that you think that it's likely that they borrowed from the Stoics?" Well, I'm saying it's possible. I'm saying I see a lot of the same terminology when I look at the text. I'm just saying that's how it looks to me when I read the works of the Stoics and I read the works of the New Testament writers. Now, it's funny how people like to quote John 3:16, but if you just go down to John 3:36, right there in the same chapter, where it reads as follows: "The one believing, that is constantly exercising faith into the Son, has everlasting life. But the one disobeying the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. The wrath of God remains on the ones not believing, the unbelievers. So you could see here that, and actually that's continually abides on them. It's a constant thing happening. When you look at it there in the original language. Then also, you have verses like Revelation 3:19, which says, "As many as I love, I rebuke, and I chastise. Be zealous then, and repent." Now, it's funny because Christians will read verse 20, but usually ignore 19. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will go into him, and I will dine with him, and he with me." Now, how many times, I'm sure that even some of my listeners listening right now have had some sort of religious Christian background where they heard this quoted at an altar call. They quoted this verse and they said, "Come on down to the front, and say this little prayer for Jesus." But it's funny because, this was actually written to believers. This was written to Christians. If you look at who Revelation chapter 3 is, addressing, it's addressing certain churches. Now, also, what did he say here? Let's back up again. Verse 19, "As many as I love." Now, if he just loves everyone equally, why would he say "as many as I love"? Now, it's funny that Cartesian theists accuse me of having a hyper-Calvinistic background, but actually at the end of the video, which is in the very video in discussion here, at the very end I said that I'm not saying that God hates everyone. I'm saying that he doesn't love everyone in a salvific sense, and then I said that he's saying he might have, according to the New Testament writers, he might have a general love for mankind, but not enough to, save them from sin, self, Satan, and hellfire. So that's the point I was trying to make in that video. And overall in the series, the 3-part series, I was just trying to show that free will, according to the New Testament authors, does not exist. They teach that man's will is an expression of his nature and that the will is in bondage to the sinful nature. And so I went through many verses establishing that. I went through many verses supporting that. I even handled some verses that supposedly teach against that and showed how they actually don't have anything to do with soteriology. If you look at the context, so unfortunately, I have to say that, yes, I think he's right when he says that there are some scholars who are not Reformed in any sense. They're not Calvinistic, and they know Greek probably just as good as Dr. James White, who is a Reformed apologist and theologian. However, I would say that most of the Greek scholars that I've met or even heard of are all Calvinistic or Reformed in their theology. So it's really difficult for me to swallow his whole claim about, it could be either one. It seems like he was saying, it could go either way. No one really knows what the text is saying. There's just as much supporting for each type of theology, and I have yet to see anyone validate the claim that synergism is taught in the New Testament, because I don't see a synergistic theology taught in the New Testament whatsoever. I don't see the ability of man being exalted. I see the ability of man being defecated on, and I see the ability of God being exalted. So I have this problem, is that I don't find any substantiation for synergistic theology in the New Testament, unless you just rip verses out of their context, and that's I don't know. That's how I've seen it, and I've been studying the New Testament for quite some time. I know Dr. Wright would concur with me on this, in spite of my atheism. So I don't want to ramble on. It's been 14 minutes or so since I've been rambling on now. We should just go to the conversation, but I kind of wanted to just get that out of the way to let you guys know what it is we were arguing about. And I'll actually leave links in the description box of the YouTube version of this podcast episode anyways, so that you can go check out my 3-part series, For God So Loved the World, and, make judgments for yourself. But I think I did a pretty reasonable, consistent exegesis of the New Testament to make the points that I was trying to make. I do recognize his objection that I didn't go through every instance in which John used the word cosmos. But again, I don't think that was necessary when all I was trying to do was show that the word can be used in other ways. Not only by John, but by other authors in the New Testament. And I have shown that clearly. I think, in all honesty, though, maybe the way in the video series I kept saying, interesting. I think he's right in a sense. I think that is kind of misleading. Just the way I kept saying interesting, and if anybody has watched that series and you're listening to this, and you got the wrong idea, if you thought, I was making the assertions that I guess he thought I was making, then I apologize for that, and hopefully this will be of some clarification for you. Now, every time I make a video or do a podcast episode or have a debate / discussion, whatever you want to call it, I always look back over that and say, oh man, I could have said this, or I could have said that, or I should have said this, and I wasn't on my best performance, I have to say. I think I was running on very little sleep that day, so I think I did pretty well considering. Now, before we go to the conversation, I want to say this. He said, he seemed to think that there were so many, so many vast scholars out there, New Testament scholars, who understand the New Testament Greek, as well as Dr. Wright, who are not Reformed, who are like Arminian or something. And I want to say this. He said that he uses the ESV translation. And if you look in the ESV translation, you're going to see who let's look at for instance, the ESV Study Bible here. It says, the theological editor was J.I. Packer, who is notoriously Reformed. Wayne Grudem, who is a Calvinist, he's a Calvinist. I do believe, though, he's kind of believing in the slain in the spirit, speaking in tongues type stuff. I can't remember his position. It's been a while. But he's Calvinist. A lot of the people involved in the translation of the ESV translation were all Calvinists. So I think that's just a little ironic. Also, if I remember correctly, he said that he's the ESV that he uses, the introduction is written by R.C. Sproul, and R.C. Sproul is a Calvinist. Anyway, without further delay, here's the conversation. All right?
Yeah, I'm recording it too.
All right, awesome. Okay, yeah, so
starting my channel back up, I've only got 15-minute slots, but then I'm hoping we can keep this to kind of 30. I did listen to your most recent one, which was like 90 minutes long, and I mean, no offense, but I mean, that's a long time. Even if you're really, really interested in the subject, 90 minutes is a
you're talking
really
about
long time.
You're talking about the podcast episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's because it's a podcast episode.
Steve and the other guy.
Jeff D. Are you talking about the one with Jeff D. on?
No, I don't know. There was a Christian caller. I think his name was Chris.
Oh, yeah. I try to keep the shows down to an hour, but
I know it's difficult when you get going.
Yeah, well, the thing is that I had guests on, and then he called in, and it's obviously that's a pretty controversial issue we were dealing with. So, yeah, it can be difficult. I was trying to press him on an issue, and then somebody would ask him a question, and it's like so yeah.
Okay, just before we get to the text, can I just ask you if
Sure.
you had any experience or exposure to Calvinism or hyper-Calvinism before making this video?
Well, first of all, hyper-Calvinism is not a real theological term, and anyone who uses that term is yikes. I don't know what to say. There's high Calvinism, there's compatibilistic Calvinism, but there is no hyper-Calvinism. I started off my Christian walk, and I'm holding up my fingers here, my quotation marks, as an Arminian. That is, I held to like prevenient grace and that type of thing. Then later on, I actually held to the same confession of faith as James White, the London Baptist Confession of 1689 and 1644. So yes, I was a Calvinist, but I was let's just say, I held pretty much to the same theology as Charles Spurgeon.
Okay. So this is where I would make my first point, really. Right at the beginning of your video, you made a very big point of saying to everybody, look, here's me, and I'm just coming to the text. This is just me in the text here, and I'm not coming with presuppositions. And I don't feel like that you were being completely honest with your audience there, and I think you might be willing to agree with me here. After all, could it really just be that independent from your previous experiences with Calvinism, you came to a very Calvinist sort of interpretation of the text here? Do you see where I'm going with this? I mean, lots of biblical scholars, and not just biblical scholars, experts in hermeneutics, have made the point that nobody comes to any text objectively. That was an Enlightenment myth. Nobody does that. Everybody comes with their own cultural, philosophical, linguistic baggage, and we all have to do, as Anthony Thistleton has said, it's like a hermeneutical spiral. And we hope that we get near to the authorial intent of what's being said. But I would rather you had been honest with people and say, well, I may have a little bit of Calvinist presuppositions going on here. I felt that was a bit dishonest.
Well, I guess we kind of have I kind of agree with you. I don't think I was being dishonest. I just don't think I was being maybe as meticulous as you would have hoped. What I meant by coming to the text was not necessarily objectively, but what I meant is to actually do an exegesis, which is to pull out of the original language what it is saying. That is, their grammatical tenses, the nuances of the language, the etymology of the words, to pull, the context, to pull out of it what it is saying. Of course, there is no such thing as a non-presupposition. We all have assumptions. We're assuming right now that we're actually talking to each other and that our brains are not in vats right now. Of course, we have assumptions. But actually, I have to say that it was actually the text itself that caused me to become a Calvinist when I was a Christian, versus like John 6:44 and 1 John 5:1. Well, particularly I would say John's writings. John is a very deterministic thinker, and you could see that in his grammatoi.
Yeah.
But I think to be fair, I think looking back on this.
But,
sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I I felt that theological presupposition was there, and I felt it would have been good to have got it out of the way right at the beginning. That's all.
Oh, okay. Sure, no problem.
Okay. In my notes here, you claimed that in John 3:16 that there's a mistranslation. That's actually what you called it. And you called it over the word whosoever, or whoever.
Correct.
You remember that, yeah?
Yes.
Whoever believes in him.
Right.
Well, again, I mean, this is splitting hairs. I mean, you know that there are English translations which say everyone, and there are English translations who say whosoever, and there are English translations that say whoever believes. And really, I think you would be really, really hard-pressed to say that there is a mistranslation. After all, I mean, let me give you this. I mean, you're talking about the receptor language, so here's how English functions. If I go into a room and I say, whosoever goes outside gets a donut, yeah? And then I come in and I say, everyone who goes outside gets a donut. They're semantically synonymous. They mean the same thing. So, again, it seemed like you were trying to make a really big thing of this, like, oh, it's a mistranslation, and really,
I think
I'm pressed to say it is.
Right. I think that looking back on that, I probably should have said an inadequate translation, because I mean the whole idea of
you've got to show that whosoever can mean substantively something different from everyone who.
Well, all words can mean, pretty much, depending on the context, can mean something different. And that's what I was trying to show with the word cosmos. But, I mean, I don't want to go off on that. But what I was saying, like, to kind of give a little commentary on why I called it a mistranslation, and that is that the pos there is in the singular. And if you look at the context of the situation, and also, it's every single one constantly exercising faith. It's a present active indicative.
Yes, which can be translated whoever. That's whoever is a good translation.
It could be translated other ways. But the point is that it's not as clear. It's not as clear in the English language if you translate it that way. It can be misleading.
Well, you need to substantiate that then.
I just did. It's a present active indicative.
Yeah.
Not whosoever. Pos is in the singular. But pisteuon, the word pisteuon, John's usual term for saved individuals, is a present active indicative. It's every single one constantly believing. It's the believing ones. So there are particular individuals he's talking about. It's not just whosoever throws their name in this little blank here. He's talking about particular individuals.
Yeah. So I want to know is how you can differentiate the meaning from just changing the word, just changing the translation from that whoever believes in him. How that's substantively changed by the translation that you agree with by saying that everyone who believes in him. How are they different?
I think that, for me personally, I think that whosoever just kind of sounds like, just whoever. I think everyone, to me at least, seems a little more particular, and I know to Dr. Downing as well. But I would say that it's not really that much different depending on how you translate the rest of the verse. So, again, I think that a lot of people get confused because most versions of the Bible are really just another take on the KJV.
No, I don't agree with that.
Well, I don't really care whether you do or do not.
Well, that's true, but I also think that I could find you a lot of biblical scholars who disagree with that as well. I mean, the methodology is completely different. Like the NIV, the philosophy of translation there is dynamic equivalence rather than literal translations. And in the 20th century, even liberal theologians like John J.A.T. Robinson made the point that literal translation doesn't work. You have to also take account of the receptor language. And if you don't take account of the receptor language, then you have a problem. So the King James Version and the New King James Version can boast to be quite literal, but really they don't have the same kind of...
Oh, well, certainly. I'm not saying every version is based on the King James. Certainly not. Yeah. But certainly if you read the majority of versions, like, for instance, let's take the ESV. The ESV, if you read the introduction, is in this, it pretty much says, if I remember correctly, that it's in the same line as the King James. So, you know, there's really a lot of, I'm talking about those versions that try to be, are less on the dynamic side of things and more on the, try to be literal, kind of like the, let's say it's been a while, James White's, the NASB, which is supposedly the most literal English version out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that. I use the ESV, and I have it in front of me now, and the introduction by Sproul doesn't even seem to mention the King James Bible.
Well, I actually have the ESV Study Bible here with me, and I had a smaller one. But yes, it does somewhere in there. I mean, I'm not going to whip it out and look for it because this will take a lot longer, and I think it's really a small issue. But I think obviously, I don't see how you're going to. I don't know. It's just a side issue. Is there something else that we could move on to? Something more important?
Yeah, well, I mean, your basic contention seems to be this very, and I'm going to call it hyper-Calvinism because there are a lot of theologians who use that phrase, so I'm going to disagree with you earlier where you rejected that phrase.
Fine, then define your term. Define your term.
There clearly are different versions of...
If you're going to use the word hyper-Calvinism, define it.
Well, yeah, I'm going to. This particular brand of hyper-Calvinism, for example, is a type of Calvinism that Spurgeon rejected. Spurgeon did believe that God loved the unbeliever. What he didn't believe was, and he writes, he even had a book against hyper-Calvinism, where he describes a certain type of hyper-Calvinist being someone who thinks that God only loves the elect. And Spurgeon himself, defines this as hyper-Calvinism, and he rejects it. So that's how I'm using the phrase here, just in that one sense, as God not loving the unbeliever. Okay? So that's how
actually, you have to define love here, because what Spurgeon was talking about, that there is a redemptive love, and there is a general love for mankind. The redemptive love, which is for those he foreset his love upon, is not the same thing as, you know, he just loves everyone the same. That is not at all what Spurgeon believed, and that's how you kind of make it sound when you fail to specify. No, I don't mean that. But what I mean is what he was writing against was this, what he thought was this, what he had encountered, this hyper-Calvinistic, as he called it, belief that God didn't love in any sense the unredeemed. Well, no, so then you are misclassifying my former position.
No, I'm not saying you are necessarily hyper-Calvinism. I just wanted to know, when I asked that, I wanted to know if you had any kind of background in Calvinism, or I wanted to see how you were going to define your Calvinism.
Okay, so
it seemed very clear to me from your exegesis that you had that kind of background.
Well, yeah. Yes, indeed.
When you do your word study, or your phrase study, if you like, of the world, I took umbrage at that as well, because you then, you make the point that John 3:16 is not supposed to be understood as just one little quip, completely ripped out of its context, and then you fly off to John chapter 17, And there had already been numerous references to the world, right back starting in John's prologue, all the way up to 3:16. At least 4 or 5 references to the phrase the world. You don't look at any of those. You fly straight off to John 17, take 2 or 3 references to the world there. And then you're off to 2 Peter, which is a different author. Clearly, I mean, most scholars think, whoever you think the authors are, most people think the author's different in 2 Peter to John. So immediately, within about 4 references, you're off onto the usage of a different author. And even going to John's letter as well is not a good move. I read John's Gospel this afternoon and took down every single time I encountered the phrase the world. And this isn't a definitive count, because when you're reading it, you just miss it, don't you? But I've collected at least 50 references in John to the phrase the world. And you don't even deal with 10% of those references before you go off to Peter. Well, now, I'm sorry, James, but I don't consider that to be very sturdy exegesis. One of the principles of good exegesis is you have to study a word or a phrase in relation to the author himself, but first and foremost into the book that he is writing. And you fail to do that, and I think that's really unfortunate.
Well, that's a lovely assertion again, but I didn't fail to do that. The video was already pretty lengthy. I had other points to make in that video, and so I was simply looking at enough usages of the word cosmos by that author to make the point that the word cosmos does not always mean every single person, past, present, and future. That is the only point that I was trying to make, and therefore I did not need to look at every single usage of the word cosmos by the author John. That would be pointless. That was not even, that would be so, redundant. Who the hell is going to watch a video that long just looking at all of the different, now maybe if I was still a preacher, and I had that time and I was up there in the pulpit or something, that would be great to be that thorough. But come on, people's attention spans, especially in YouTube.
Yeah, James. No, I think you should come on here, because if you spent as much time as you did, you spent a lengthy amount of time in 2 Peter and in 1 John and then in Revelation, making a completely another point about Revelation being written to the Christians and so on, which I don't think many Christian scholars would disagree with. You spent those are your 3 last points. They didn't even need to be in the video. You could have just stayed with references to the world in John's Gospel, and you could have left 2 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation for another video. But you seem very keen to go elsewhere, and I think that's telling. And we may well have to agree to disagree here, but I think it's a very sound principle of exegesis and very well accepted principle of exegesis by liberals and conservatives alike, that you have got to stay in that document, and really 3 brief references elsewhere. When the authors use that phrase 50 times is just simply not good enough.
Well, but let me tell you something. Just the fact that I could show one time that John uses the word differently is all that it takes. And then secondly, just the fact that I can show another New Testament author who uses the word in different ways is all that it takes. So your whole point is really just relative in your own opinion. It is not anything objective. I'm sorry that you don't like my video, but you still have failed to point to where I'm wrong about my assertion that John and other New Testament authors use the word cosmos in different ways. That is the only point I was making in that portion of the video. Yeah. If your problem is with, you didn't show enough, didn't show enough usages of the word cosmos, if that is your issue here, and also, now, yes, of course I went on to other topics. I had other topics to address in that video. So, the whole video wasn't going to be about that one thing. I'm sorry you don't like that. But again, that is arbitrary. That is not any strike against what I was saying. You have not at all dealt with my argumentation. You have simply said, well, there's 50 other usages. That's great. But all that is besides the point. That has nothing to do with the point of what I was trying to make in the video. You have failed to address the issue.
Remember your own video properly now, because your point was not just to make the point that John uses the word or the phrase in different ways. That really is not a very...
now you're going to tell me what I was thinking and what my purpose was? Seriously?
That's not, yeah, because I just watched it a minute ago, and there's something else you said. Toward the end of the video, you're not just contending that John uses the phrase in different ways. What you're doing is you're suggesting, because John uses it in different ways, therefore he must be using it in those different ways back in John 3:16. Now, this is the fallacy called an unwarranted restriction of a semantic field, and you commit it all over the place. And what you're doing is you're suggesting, okay, here's the author using the word or the phrase in one way over here. Oh, but 10 chapters later they use it in a different way over here. Therefore, back 10 chapters earlier, they must be using it in the same way. And that is exactly what the fallacy of unwarranted restriction of a semantic field is.
Can you quote from where I actually said that? Or are you gonna
be naughty, James?
Are you seriously gonna reprimand me on something I never said, but that you think I was implying? Is that seriously your argument?
I can actually play the ending if you want me to.
Yeah, please play the ending, because maybe I just don't remember correctly.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm wrong, I want to know.
What, you don't remember contending that the text wasn't saying that God loves everyone?
I remember contending that the text, first of all, the emphasis is not even on love. The emphasis is on a constant, continuous life of faith. First of all, the text there is exegetical. It's not meant to be quoted by itself. It is an explanation of the verses prior. Any scholar, almost any scholar that I'm aware of, would actually agree with me on that. Dr. Downing, Dr. James White. Just name a few.
With that either. In fact, I'm insisting that's exactly what you didn't do. You didn't look at any of the uses of the word prior to 3:16. But what you do say in the video is that you're saying the text, the way John uses the word, you insist he doesn't mean everybody.
Did you by any chance watch the other two videos?
No, I haven't seen either of those.
So then you didn't see... hold on. So then you didn't see where it actually did go back to John chapter 1 and John chapter 3, and actually back to... Yeah, I mean, you didn't...
Then your videos are very, very messy, mate, because, I mean, doing 3 little quotes out of John, then going to 2 Peter, 1 John, Revelation in the first video, and then not saying that there will be future videos where you'll come back to John. I mean, that's just messy, so that just even more confirms my view that, you've messed this up, really.
No, actually it doesn't, but again, nice arbitrary assertions.
No, I think, what you're calling an arbitrary assertion is my opinion, and that's what I...
yeah, that's what arbitrary means. It's your opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's arbitrary. I could care less about opinion. What I want to know is fact.
Yeah, well, when it comes to hermeneutics, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, James.
Well, actually, by the way, I pretty much mirrored the same exegesis and the same argument that Dr. Downing of the Pacific Institute for Religious Studies did, who's an expert on both Hebrew and Greek. You can check him out on Sermon Audio, and he wrote a textbook on Greek and also Hebrew. He teaches this, so you're not just contending with my exegesis, you're contending with him, and he's been in the ministry and doing this for almost 50 years.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but believe me, I can drop names as well, because I have sat in front of me George Beasley Murray's commentary and Don Carson's commentary, and both of them disagree with him. And they do so from the Greek as well, because they're both Greek scholars as well. And all this points to, James, is that actually it's not about the Greek. It's a difference of opinion about the context of the words and exactly what John's getting to. And lots of theologians and New Testament commentators disagree on exactly where John means what when he's saying the phrase "the world."
Well,
but
of
there are
course.
but there are some themes that come through, and a lot of commentators agree that the majority way in which John uses the phrase "the world" is referring to the sinful world, is referring to the fallen world. And this is why he makes this contrast all through his gospel he makes it between, on lots of words, like light and darkness, spirit and flesh, above and below, good and evil. And he makes this dichotomy on a lot of things. And he makes this dichotomy as well with this phrase, "the world." But that doesn't tie him down. That doesn't mean to say that, he always has to use a word in a certain way. So whilst, let's be clear.
Well, no, I've never said that. I've never said that he has to use a word in a certain way.
Yeah, I know. But
okay, well, I just want to make sure that you're not...
No, because I'm about to say...
Okay.
That's why I agree with you that John can and does use the phrase "the world" in different ways.
Right, and that's all that I'm saying. I'm not saying, and hold on, let me clarify something real quick.
Yeah.
If I sounded, anybody who's listening to this, if I sounded as though that's what I was trying to hint at, that John meant that in John 3:16, and I know that for a fact, then I apologize, because that's not at all what I was saying. But when you look at John's style of writing, when you look at how he puts, for instance, believing ones in the present tense, and then he puts, he puts born of God in the perfect tense, then he does this time and time and again. He does this with born of God and also loving God. He had a very deterministic theology. You can see that in John. It's very obvious. So did Paul. I can take you to different places where Paul. So that's one of the reasons that lead me to believe that it's quite possible that's how he was using the word "world." But no, it's not a fact. I mean, I can't, I'm not saying, oh, that's that. And if you don't agree with me, then you're just infantile. But and I hope I haven't come off that way. And if I have, again, I apologize.
I think, unfortunately, many times you pointed to a phrase and then you didn't actually draw a conclusion. You just said, "interesting." Several times in the video, you pointed to something and then you just said, "interesting." And what, for me, at least personally, as I watched it, that made it sound like you were trying to hint that there's some kind of conspiracy here, and that anybody who has a non-Calvinistic reading of these verses, really doesn't understand what's going on. And whilst I agree with you, of course, that there are Calvinistic Greek scholars, it's also worth keeping in mind that there are other scholars who know the Greek just as well, and they don't agree at all that John or Paul are deterministic. If you're meaning that as some kind of fatalism or Calvinistic doctrine, there are plenty of Arminian and Molinist New Testament scholars who read Greek who do not...
Hold on, Calvinism is not fatalistic. There is a... do you even understand Calvinism? And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I mean, a lot of people...
Yes, but you use the word determinism, so you need to say what you mean by that.
Okay, well, what I mean is that... Okay, hold on. Well, let me explain. So the natural man, the sukeikos man, does not desire the things of God, neither can he know them. We also see that in John chapter 3, that he does not come to the light. Okay? He does not desire the light. He fears the light. We see also where Paul also talks about in Romans chapter 8 that he is dead. He is necrous. We see that Jesus says that he, in John, I believe it's in chapter 6, says that anyone who commits sin is a slave of sin, a doulos, and that is a present active, I believe. He is habitually a slave to sin. Anyone who practices these things. John uses this in other places and even in his letters. John has pretty much the same grammar and every style of writing that he has in his gospel that he does in his letters. John is a very easy style of Greek to start off with. It's like it's a very low level. Okay, so basically to kind of truncate this down is that man is dead in trespasses and sins. He cannot choose Christ savingly. He cannot choose righteousness. Like the lion, he hates righteousness because he has, or like the lion, he hates the righteous salad and craves the sin steak. And until he is given a new nature, he will never be able to do so because he's dead. He can't save himself. He's dead in trespasses and sins. He needs to be regenerated by the Holy Spirit. The beginning of John chapter 3, the Spirit blows where it listeth. You cannot tell where it comes and where it goes.
Okay.
Okay, so no one can come to me unless the Father draws him to me, and I will raise him up at the last day. The word there can also be translated to drag. So the position here is that man needs a new nature in order, and that is the salvation, and that is what bears the fruit. Is when man is given a new nature, and then he craves righteousness. He craves salvation. He sees his weight of sin. He sees that he's a sinner, and therefore, but without that regeneration, he will never love God. He will always reject God, and he cannot. He is unable, dunatai. So that is so you see there that man gets what he wants, and he chooses what he wants. Do you see how that kind of works out?
Of course, and you now know what all the texts are that Arminians will bring up that will actually throw the spanner in the works to all of those.
Well, no, because I've already dealt with those.
Classic Arminianism doesn't actually reject any of those texts, and probably most of the interpretations you're giving there as well. Because as you know, Arminianism believes in efficient grace, so it's not that man in his own...
You mean prevenient grace?
Well, yeah, I mean the same thing. So it's not like, human beings can choose God, but they're given a certain grace where they can be put in that place to make a free choice. So I don't know any Arminian theologians who, are making a campaign for any of those verses to be taken out of the Bible. This idea of being dead in sins, being a slave to sin, they're all very good analogies, and Arminians don't reject them. None of those verses actually...
I know that. You're describing a Molinistic... almost like a William Lane Craig position. And I'm very familiar with the Senator Dwart in the 5 points of Arminianism and also the theology of Wesley. But what I'm saying here is that nowhere does it say that God looks down the corridors of time, sees who will choose him, and then make a decision to choose them on the basis of their choice that he foresaw. That wouldn't be grace. That's synergism.
Yeah, and nowhere does it say that he unconditionally elects people either.
Actually, it says in Romans chapter 9, as I'm sure you know.
A very hotly debated chapter, I see.
Yeah, I know, and I know we're not going to go there because that's just... But
I mean, are you and I going to sort out Romans 9?
Yeah, I know. I know.
Please.
But
if you,
I think the real contention though, right? I think the real contention though is God causative in soteriology, or is he responsive? In other words, who has the final decision? Who makes the final choice? If it's man, can't man say, for instance, how can I say this a better way? What's the difference between me and you? Is it that you had a better heart? Is that why you chose Jesus and I didn't? What is the deciding factor? And I think that's really the contention we would have. Is God causative or responsive?
Yeah, I mean, that might be one way of putting it, but I don't see for this particular discussion on John that we need to entirely get into the theology of Arminianism versus Calvinism. I think what we're admitting is that there are those presuppositions that are going on in any exegesis. The point that I'm making, simply because I don't want this to go on forever, is that I think it's more complicated than you're making out in that video. it feels to me that you're making out in that video that there's something a little bit suspect going on. And I think it's the fact that you often use this word interesting, and you say this after you go to other moments in the New Testament where John's using the phrase, and I would prefer it if you didn't do that. I would prefer it if you actually said what you mean and actually try and draw some kind of conclusion, and also as well to try and recognize that different authors have different readings. If I give you mine very briefly, as I look, and now my presuppositions are non-Calvinist. I'm not a 5-point Arminianist either. I think Arminianism and Calvinism are both systematic theologies that are both products of medieval theology, trying to impose certain presuppositions upon the text. So I don't fit nicely into either camp. But I still have my own presuppositions, and I hope I know a lot of them, and there's probably some that I don't. Mm-hmm. But as I look at the text, and the text says in the prologue that Jesus is coming into the world, and it says that in 1 verse 10, it says, the world did not know him. So that's clearly implying this fallen world. And then in 1:29, it says that Jesus is the one who takes away the sin of the world. So again, the world is seen in a very sort of fallen, sinful state. And then the next time we come to the verse, it's 1 verse 29. Which again is where we get the sin of the world mentioned. And then in 3:16 we get, for God so loved the world. And I think that the most consistent reading there is that the world again is seen as, this is a radical verse. It's saying that God so loved the world. I'm going with the majority interpretation. That doesn't make it right either, but I think there's a case to be made from the context of the usage of the word. And since I was just looking up, I don't know if you know Donald Guthrie. Donald Guthrie was a very famous New Testament scholar in this country. And in his New Testament theology, which is kind of his most important contribution to theology, he makes the point that, let me just quote, he says, start quotation, more distinctive of John's Gospel is the use of cosmos, of the sinful world, which is in conflict with God. And then he says, the reader of the Gospel is prepared for this in the prologue, where the statement about the Word being in the world is followed by the emphatic assertion that the world knew him not, John chapter 1, verse 10. Also in the prologue is the antithesis between light and darkness. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that in John's Gospel, the majority of the time when John's using this phrase, the world, cosmos, he means it in a negative way. He means it in a dualistic way from those who've actually been redeemed. So on that basis, that the most of the time he's using the phrase this way, personally, along with a lot of other conservative and liberal scholars, my reading would be that love the world is an absolutely radical phrase here. What John is actually saying, according to many commentators, is that God loves the fallen world so much that he gives his only begotten Son. And Don Carson gives a good reason for this reading as well. Sorry to chunder on here, I'll stop in a moment. But the reason he gives is because the verse doesn't sound radical at all. If God sends his Son for the redeemed, for those who will believe, well, this isn't an action really of great love. I mean, this is no better than someone just rescuing their own family in a situation where many people are going to die. But Carson points out that actually, this whoever, everyone who will believe in him, can have that eternal life. And so personally, not just personally, but along with many commentators, Beasley Murray, as I say, who I read recently,
right.
My reading would be that love the world is this more radical notion that it is this fallen world, because that is the majority way in which John uses the phrase. Anyway, I'll shut up now. Oh,
well, sure. And I would agree with some of that. I mean, I do think that he is, the author John is using that word primarily in a negative fashion. But then we go to verses here in chapter 17, and we read, I pray, right, for who? I pray for you, not the world. I pray concerning them. I do not pray concerning the world, but those whom you gave me, talking to the Father, for they are yours. So he's distinguishing here between, again, like Peter does, there is a two different groups here. There is the world, and there are those that the Father has given out of the world. And he also, in his letters, distinguishes. He says, you are in the world, but you are not of the world. And he also goes into, different marks of grace, that those who are redeemed, possess these. That you have stepped out of life unto death because you love the brethren. Certain types of marks of grace. So we see that. We also see here in the first chapter of John where he says...
Just before we go on to 1 John, can I just stay in John 17 for just
Sure.
one second?
We could stay there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I agree with that interpretation. I think that John is continuing his dichotomy here between the world and the believers. It's just that Jesus in John 17, he has prayed for the world. He cries over Jerusalem because, it won't believe in him. But also in John 17, you've got something rather unique and special there. Jesus here is only praying for his believers, but that doesn't mean to say that he's never prayed or he's not concerned about other people. And I didn't like, again, I have to say I didn't like where you made it sound like, because you pointed out phrases like John describing himself as the disciple who Jesus loved, and after that you said, interesting. Again, I put it down in my notes, and this is where I think you needed to drop the word interesting and actually say what you mean, because it sounded to me like you were trying to imply that, that Jesus didn't love everyone just because John is described as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That doesn't mean to say, and also in John's gospel.
Well, interesting was more or less meant as a. I guess you'd have to look at the text in the original to understand. He switches back using two different kinds of word for the love. There's a feeling and there's an agapao type of love in that chapter. So there's a word play there, and I think you kind of have to look at that. But I believed that he has a general love, as it says. He sends his rains on the just and the unjust. But there wasn't that redemptive love. Notice he says, I pray for them, not for the world. So I think the New Testament definitely teaches many are called, few are chosen. That there is an outward call, there is a redemptive call, there is an effectual calling, and then there is a general call, which is, the call goes out to all men, right? Acts 17:30. God commands everyone everywhere to repent. But not everyone will repent. Acts 13:48. Some people are not going to be granted even that. So, and again, that's going from aorist tense to perfect tense, which further helps support the theology I'm talking about. But that's another.
What I would say is that you came across as suggesting that because Jesus is described as loving certain people, that this might imply that he didn't love others, which I'm sure you weren't trying to suggest, because that would be utterly ridiculous. That would be like saying I can't say I love my wife because that might mean I don't love my children. Let's see that's blatantly.
Let's say it like this. Let's say it like this. Let's say that you really have a crush. You really had a crush on your wife at some point. Okay, so let's go back in time when you first met your wife. Okay, and before you guys got together and had a relationship. So let's say you really did, and you got this
James. We don't talk about that stuff here. Sorry, go on.
So you got this note from this person you really, really, you really love this girl. And she sends you this note that says, oh, I just really love you, Cartesian. And then you're like, and then you read the rest of it and it says, but I just love everybody.
Yeah.
What does it do to that love? And I think that's why they use different words for the word love. I think there is a redemptive love. There is a, Jesus says, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. There is actually different types of believing. Those that John are talking about that are saved, it's a present active indicative. They're constantly believing. It doesn't end. It continues on into the future. And then there are those who believed, but then only for a while because of the miracles. Yeah, of course, you have to look at the context. You got to look at the tenses. Yeah. I'd agree with that.
But I don't think that the Greek solves it. Have you come across a book called Exegetical Fallacies by Don Carson? He's a New Testament scholar and a Greek scholar as well. And in his book, one of his chapters on exegetical fallacies is word study fallacies. And in there, he argues quite extensively that the use of agapeo and filio don't have any substantive difference.
Right. Dr. White does that too.
Because Jesus says, in that little exchange with Peter at the end, Jesus asks Peter, the first two times he asks Peter, do you love me? He uses agapeo. And Peter responds with filio both times. And then Jesus the third time says, do you filio me? Do you love me? And Peter responds in kind, using filio. And just the way in which they're used...
right, but you
would have to be...
You missed... You didn't quote the whole thing. He said, feed my sheep. Each time, right?
Yeah.
Why did he say feed my sheep?
About the Greek words for love there. And Carson makes the point that it would be fallacious to think that those two words were being used in radically different ways. So all I'm pointing out there is that there are Greek scholars who don't think that there are huge distinctive differences between agapeo and filio.
The Christians did make the word agapao more in more usage. The authors, because it really wasn't in much use at that time, and the Christians did actually help that in become a rather attractive meme, and made it changed even I think the word usage from that point on, but. I'm not entirely convinced. I have heard some different arguments. I've heard Dr. White talk about this as well. I hold his work to high esteem, but he still has yet to convince me on this, simply because it seems when he's using this type of word, the context usually always is an obedient type of love, like feed my sheep. He's talking to Peter, if you love me, and Peter's like, yeah, I have emotional feelings for you. And he's saying, feed my sheep. In other words, this obedient kind of love that goes beyond just feeling, but actually causes action. Which also meshes well with what Jesus said in John chapter 14. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. So I'm not entirely convinced. I think there are some decent arguments, but I don't know. I'm still kind of. You know what I mean? I'm not entirely convinced on that one. So
that's okay.
Yeah.
I would just recommend reading it up. I mean, I'm definitely not trying to convince you on that point. I'm just suggesting, or I'm just pointing out that there are Greek scholars who are saying, look, there really is no difference between agapeo and filio. That's all I'm saying here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll talk to religion.
Does James White draw a big distinction between... I'm not very familiar with James White. I've read one book of his on the King James version, the King James debate.
Sure. Oh, yeah. I mean,
that's the book of his I've read. Do you know if he makes a big distinction between agapeo and filio?
I've heard him mention that in passing, but I haven't seen his arguments for it. And but he has mentioned that in passing. The only book I've read of his, I think, is The Forgotten Trinity, which I like. I'd probably even read it again now as a non-believer. But yeah, I enjoy his writings. I just haven't had a chance to read his arguments on that. But yeah, I know he mentioned that in passing. It might have been on the dividing line at one point, and that was an exegetical fallacy, but he never stated why. I'll talk to Religion Free Deist about that. He's pretty good on the Greek, and he keeps up on it. So I'll have to. He knows probably way bit more than I do. Doesn't focus so much on the grammar of it though as I do. He's yeah.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to keep you much longer. I mean, we've been 51 minutes now, and, I don't want to draw it out. I mean, just in conclusion, what I would say is that, what I would like to see personally, where you're doing exegesis, is maybe a little bit broader in terms of recognizing that there are other traditions, and just asking you to maybe recognize. I mean,
sure.
I think it's fair to say that the Calvinistic position is a minority position, in terms of Christianity over the last 2,000 years, and there are other conservative scholars out there.
Sure, but I think it's kind of misleading when you say minority position. Because most churches were reformed before the Remonstrant, and as a matter of fact, before the 1600s, and most churches were reformed churches, Protestant churches.
What, in Europe?
Huh?
You're
and in the United States. Oh yeah. In fact, Arminius himself came
in the United States.
Huh? No. I'm talking about in the 1600s in Europe, obviously. But I'm saying as far as, even after that, for a long time in the United States, because Arminianism is a very new thing, okay? Yes, there was Pelagianism back in Augustine's day, but that was when you look from the Reformers on, for a good solid... several hundred years, it was a very, doctrines of grace type thing. The doctrines of grace
came before Calvin.
Huh?
Arminius was before Calvin.
Well,
that's why Calvin wrote them in 5 parts, because they were 5 rejections of Arminianism.
Right, but no, Calvin actually never wrote that. His followers wrote the...
Of course, that's a matter of debate, isn't it? Whether it was Calvin or Beza.
No, he was dead. He was dead. He never wrote that. In his
Institutes of Christian Religion, I mean, the systematization of it comes later in.
Oh yeah. Okay, then we're on the same page. Then I thought you were saying the actual 5 points systematized.
No.
Oh, okay. I was about, man, you need to study up there. No, yeah. I'm sorry, I misunderstood you.
It's okay.
Correct. Yes, but Arminius himself was from a Dutch Reformed family. Was raised in a Dutch Reformed household, and actually, like the Free Will Baptists, the Arminian position, this is all a pretty new thing. This is not, when you look through the history of Christianity, this is not something that is, that has been around longer than Calvinism. That would be a really misleading statement. And actually,
I think if you read your Christian history, you see that both traditions go back and go back all the way back.
Sure, and at one point, the synergistic view, or
over who gets there first, really.
Right. Well, at one point, the synergistic view, I think early, was pretty much a majority thing. We don't know how long, because for the first 300 years Christianity was outlawed and people didn't sit down and have time to do theology. So there's a lot of stuff that's missing there. But I do know that some of the early church fathers would have some heretical views on the Trinity and other things. And some other things that we may consider even Pelagian, perhaps. But I guess what I'm saying is I think there has always been a deterministic theology, but this Arminian, this synergistic theology is something that's very new. All Baptists historically were originally Calvinistic in the sense that they were deterministic. So a lot of people like to argue they came out of the Protestant Reformation, but I know of quite a few Baptists who would disagree with that. So, yeah, it's a touchy issue, but and it's really irrelevant how long, the historical. I mean, that's really irrelevant. What matters, I think, is what the text supports, and I think that can be determined.
So, I mean, I think I've sort of given you my view why, I felt the way I did about your video.
Sure.
And,
sure. Well, also taken in
I appreciate you hearing me out.
Sure, but just take into consideration that these are videos. I mean, you do realize that most atheists don't, I mean, as far as what I can see, don't really understand the difference between the theologies. And I felt that the Calvinist position was being missed by atheists, and they'll say, ignorant stuff like, oh, you don't, you believe I'm going to hell because I don't believe in Jesus. No, that's actually a very theologically ignorant statement. And I was trying to reach atheists and show them a different theological standpoint so they could understand the difference, and so that they could actually deal with the opponent's position instead of throwing out straw men. And that was my main reason for doing videos like that. It wasn't meant to be exhaustive.
Yeah.
Like I said,
none of it can be.
Right. So
it's like, just a little plea would be, I mean, to sort of, say that right at the beginning, and, or to put it in the blurb underneath, because, it did come across very differently than that to me. And, I mean, I don't mean this in an insulting way, in any way whatsoever, okay? But, wow, you are the weirdest atheist I've ever met. I've never met an atheist who's kind of concerned that Calvinism might be being misinterpreted.
Well, it's really my concern that anyone's position might be misinterpreted, because I'm a realist more than anything else, and I want people to grasp reality and to want to grasp reality, and I want people to actually stop talking past each other and start dealing with each other. And I think that's a lot of what's going on. And also this ownage and ponage type thing where, oh, I'm smarter than you. No, I'm smarter than you. Or, just grow up already. It's not about that. And I think we need to have compassion on one another enough to try to understand one another. And I have to say that I disagree with you putting my video in a lineup like you did. I think it was like Atheist's Dumbest Videos. I think that's a very polemic and unnecessary.
I did use the word stupid, but I like exaggeration and hyperbole, and it doesn't mean to say, I didn't say they're stupid people. I felt that they were stupid videos. I put, that was the title of the basket that it went in. And as I saw the video, I'm not entirely sure I would still back down from, that word. And, I'm sorry if that offends you, but I felt it was, in the sense that it was only picking one particular line, one traditional interpretation of that. And it wasn't giving everybody the broader picture. And I felt it should have been fairer and given a broader picture rather than just narrowing it down. That's because you're on the other end of the stick. And I don't feel that there is an equal, I don't think that there's an equal chance that your position is going to be more consistent with the original language. I'm sorry. There's just too much in it. 1 John 5:1, you have to deal with the golden chain of redemption, and, in Romans 8, there's a lot I could throw out there that your position fails to deal with, and also it's philosophically incoherent. Are you going to go process theology? Are you going to say that God doesn't know something on purpose? To get away from. I mean, it almost seems like in process theology, you're going to have to go to an Alzheimer's deity. You're going to have to say, God chooses not to know certain things.
And
yeah, if you know your theology as well as you say, James, then you know that there are conservative scholars who do take the text seriously, who know their Greek, and yet they're not process theologians, and they are not liberals, and they do genuinely believe in free will in a broadly Arminian or Molinist sense. So, let's not pretend that those people aren't out there. They are out there. I'm not forced into
sure, Dr. Geisler, sure.
Yeah.
But, I mean, he's sadly incorrect. I mean, I think the Potter's Freedom definitely deals with his so-called exegesis quite well. And very systematically.
Geisler's not the only one out there. I mean, there are tons of these people.
Oh, sure. But they always, when I see them actually try to argue against the Calvinist position, they end up arguing against something totally the Calvinists never even say. Like, as though Calvinism makes people robots. And I mean, just, yeah, I would admit that there are people who know the text quite well, who have a different position. But I don't think that's because of the text. I don't think that's because of the text.
Yeah.
That's the problem. I think if they actually dealt with the text fairly, I think that they would see that it isn't a synergistic view at all. Just go to Galatians chapter 1. Look where Paul says, if you preach another gospel, anyone other than the one I bring to you, let him be anathema. Look at the two different words there, translated another. One being another of an altogether different kind, another being another of the same kind. Paul goes out of his way to make that very clear. Look at Ephesians 2:8, where he says, and this faith, not of yourselves, the gift of God. So even the faith is a gift of God, or not. So where do you get this idea, where do you get this idea that somehow the synergistic position is on equal footing? I have no idea.
Well, can I ask you then, how many non-Calvinistic theologians you've read and what their books are?
Well, I've read some of Dr. Geisler's work. I mean, this has been quite a while since I've read,
He's considered slightly more popularistic, though, than, someone like Alvin Plantinga, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, Geisler's not really.
He's.
Like your top 50
I would put. I don't think that. I don't really hold Albert Plantinga right at high esteem when it comes to dealing with the text. I think he's more of a philosopher like Craig. I don't think he actually does an exegesis. I see him coming to. The problem is that people come to the text with. They don't do much of a word study and study what the language meant to the people back then, and they come to the text with lenses that are 20 centuries thick, full of just tradition. And I did that for a long time too, and I think everyone does. They go off of what their pastor says or whatever, but then you go and actually study the original language. You study. You pick up your Vine's expository expanded edition. You pick up commentaries on the particular words. You go take a Greek class, and you begin to see that first of all, the grammar matters a lot. What the words meant to them back then matters a lot. There's a lot of things that matter. The context, the word uses, the etymology, all these things have to be taken into consideration. And what I see is, I don't see, excuse me if I'm wrong, but I don't see prevenient grace anywhere implied in there. I see people reading that into it, but I don't see it. And no, I'm not saying that just because the word prevenient grace or the term isn't in there. Of course, there are a lot of terms that aren't in there that I would say are biblical, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying even the implication of it, I don't see it in there. And I see people reading that into the text, but I don't see that. I see in Ephesians where it's, I will do this. I will give you this. I, did this and I did that from God, not anything from man. I don't see any of that. I see man's ability being not exalted, but I see it being destroyed and defecated on by the New Testament writers. So I don't see any reason to exalt man's ability and to make God the prisoner of his own universe. I even had a Christian call in my show the other day and tell me that God doesn't have free will, but we do. And he was an Arminian. So, I mean,
that's a weird position, but all I would suggest there, James, is maybe spending less time around this, Dr. White, and maybe...
I don't. He doesn't even talk to me.
You do mention his name quite a bit, and maybe...
Right, well, that's because I've learned...
Listening to him, and maybe,
it's funny...
Maybe reading a few Arminian theologians.
I think I mentioned him a lot because he pisses me off. And he harps on consistency, and yet I find so much inconsistency, not necessarily in his work, but in his debates and argumentation. And me and Religion Free Deists both have that beef with him. But actually, I learned the most from Dr. Downing. I learned a lot from him about Greek and from reading his textbook. And I do mention James White a lot, and that's because he is somebody who, come on, this is the guy that people go to consult to make a version in the first place. This is a guy who reads it like English. There
are other scholars who read Greek as well as Dr. White, and yet come to completely opposing theological.
Well, sure. I know of one.
Let's not suggest for a moment that the Greek leads one to Calvinism.
Well, I know one. I know one who teaches at Golden Gate Seminary in San Francisco, who actually lives here. He flies out there at certain times. Anyways, and he reads the Greek very well. He teaches it. His name is Dr. Maury Robertson, and he's not a Calvinist. I guess he's almost there, kind of getting there. But again, I think a lot of it has to do with tradition and also the willingness to see the inability of yourself in the text. Nobody wants to see that. They want to have free will. Just as many people want there to be a loving sky daddy, or they want there to be a life after death where they're going to see their family members. Well, we don't have any reason to believe that with the information I have. So why do people believe that? Is that clear in the text? Is that clear in the text of reality before us? Have we ever seen anybody come back to life? Have we seen spirits flying around? When someone gets, an anesthetic and loses consciousness, if someone has Alzheimer's, why did they lose memory? There's really no reason for us to glean that from reality, but yet we do. So I don't think that looking at the text as it is and not coming to it with this tradition that you've been taught, I think that it is more likely to lead you to Calvinism than any other theological position.
Yeah, okay, but all I'm asking you to bear in mind is that you've drawn that conclusion whilst admitting that Calvinism has been a very heavy influence on you, and you're struggling to really tell me that you've really read too many Arminian or at least non-Calvinistic theologians too carefully. So I suppose I could be kind of fair in suggesting that maybe you've not read both sides of the argument as well as you should have.
Well, see, it wasn't, like I said before, I started out as an Arminian, and it wasn't it wasn't necessarily the arguments of Calvinists. It was when I started to really look at the Greek and see the verses like 1 John 5:1 and verses like that and John 6:44 in the context, that's what persuaded me. It wasn't, I'm a follower of Dr. White, or I'm a follower of Downing, or it wasn't any of that. Before I even heard of those people,
if that's so clear to you, and you as you admit, you do a little bit of dabbling in the Greek, but you're no Greek scholar. So what you've got to ask yourself, if it's so clear to you, Calvinism in the Greek, to you as a layman in Greek, why isn't it so obvious to real, genuine scholars who speak the Greek as fluently as if it were their own language. Why have they not come to the conclusion you have? And I think that's what you need to go away and think about, and maybe ask some of these people, find some of these people, track them down, and ask them, well, here's my reading of the Greek. How do you read it and still hold on to your Arminian theology? And I think that's where reading some different books on different views on the issue will help. There's a book that came out at the end of last year called Divine Providence, 4 Views on Divine Providence, and it's got a couple of Calvinists in there and a couple of Arminian responses as well. And I mean, I just recommend that. That might be a place to start. But you know, I'm not trying to patronise you.
Well, if you want to send me. If you want to send me...
I do want to suggest that you can't just keep saying, well, I came to the Greek and the Greek points obviously to Calvinism, because obviously it doesn't. Because there are so many Greek scholars out there who are not Calvinists. So it's not really a good argument to say, well, the Greek just leads me to Calvinism. It might lead you to Calvinism, but there are loads of people who know the Greek better than you who don't come to that view. So it's not a very solid argument.
Well, I wouldn't exactly call myself a layman either. I do translate the text, and I translate it sure as hell a lot more accurate than the ESV. That's for damn sure. But I'm not exactly a scholar in the sense that I have some sort of degree that I wave around in front of people and say, "Here, I have a degree. Take my word on shit." You know.
Yeah.
No, I'm self-taught. I've been taught a little bit from people. From what I've picked up, but most of the work I've done on my own, and you know, that's just to do with diligence, not with intelligence.
Yeah,
so,
but at the same time, James, any of us can say, "Oh, you know, I think I can write a better paper than so-and-so, or I can translate this better than someone else." But unfortunately, the testing ground for that is always academia. Whether you like it or not, it's academia. And, you know, creationists go around saying, "Oh, well, you know, we know that fossils, this, that, and the other." And you ask them, or ID proponents, well, where's your peer-reviewed papers then? And that is a perfectly fair question to ask. And of course, when Mr. Behe can't produce any peer-reviewed papers for his intelligent design theories, we then say, well, that's case closed. So even though we don't like it, we do have to admit that, you know, peer review and academia does actually matter to some degree.
Oh, well, I'm not saying it doesn't matter. What I'm saying is that a piece of paper and a title doesn't matter at all. What matters is does the person have the experience? Can the person do it? Look at Dr. Hovind, if we could even call him that. I mean, here's a guy that has a doctorate. Well,
did he not buy his doctorate?
He actually went to a school, but it wasn't accredited. Okay, but here's a guy who has a title. Okay, well, so fucking what? Okay, I could put any title I want on myself. I could go online right now for a couple blocks and become reverend. You know, that doesn't matter for anything.
It's true, but not anybody can get peer-reviewed. I think there's the difference. Anybody can make it. I mean, almost anybody can make it through hook or by crook.
Right, but there's a difference between science.
But getting stuff peer-reviewed is a bit different.
Right, but there's a difference between. I mean, we're talking about science. Well, actually, we're talking about you know, translations, and we're talking about the knowledge of the text. We're not talking about science.
Yeah. Yeah,
those
but
are different
there are journals
things
for that, aren't there? I mean, there are journals in New Testament studies. So, you know, I mean, for example, if you felt that you had a case that there's a passage in the ESV or in any other English translation that you can translate better, what you can do is write a paper and you can send that in. And obviously, if it gets accepted into the journal, then what the scholars are suggesting is that you might be onto something there. So, I mean, I'm just suggesting that might be a project that you might be interested in to see that, you know, if actually you could do that. But, I mean, all I'm suggesting is it doesn't really take us anywhere to, you know, to suggest, oh, I could translate this better, or, oh, I could be a better theologian than this person or that person. I'm just saying anybody can say that, but the proof of the pudding is, you know, whether you can actually go toe-to-toe with these people in peer review. Anyway, I don't want to make a huge issue of that anyway, and I'm not trying to talk you down here in any way.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'm not trying to talk down academia, but at the same token, I think that a lot of people have the tendency to say, well, this person has a degree, and take things on authority, which is a fallacy. Well, obviously, I mean, if you're getting your car fixed, or if you need medical attention, you're going to go to somebody with a degree in the medical field.
Sure.
You're not going to go to Joe Schmo down the block that says, well, I stayed in I read a couple journals on the, I read a couple, things on the subject. So obviously there are differences, and it depends on what we're talking about here. But, I think a lot of people do take a lot of things on authority, and they think just because so-and-so says this and so-and-so has this, that it must be true. Well, no, not necessarily. And I'm not saying that I am the best translator in the world. There are definitely some texts that are in the New Testament that I probably wouldn't be able to translate very accurately. But there are definitely some in there that I look at it and I go, why in the hell did they translate it like this? And a lot of it has to do with trying to make it sound better in the English language. It's an inflected language that you're trying to put into English language, which is not an easy task, especially you want it to be comprehensible to the average English speaking person. And Greek has a totally different word order, has a totally different grammatical system. It's positioning is emphasis, where in English it's not like that. In Greek you can say ball through boy, you can say boy through ball, and it means pretty much the same thing. But in English it just means nothing. It's gibberish. In Greek, you can jam a bunch of words all into one, and that's great grammar. There's nothing wrong with that. In English, you can't do that. You can't have a word that's a sentence long. It just doesn't work. So, obviously there's some differences there.
For sure. I'm not quite as skeptical on you as to whether the layman who knows no Greek can actually know the New Testament. I think they can. I think they can know 95%, if not more, of exactly what the Greek is saying from the English. There are odd places where it helps to have, a minister who can delve into the Greek a bit, but I really don't think that there's too much, certainly in terms of primary doctrine, that's really compromised.
Oh, no, not as far as primary doctrine.
A few things are hidden in the Greek.
Oh, I would agree with that, absolutely. Yeah. But I think there are, I think they can have a general understanding. I think as far as a meticulous understanding, no. And that's a shame. Especially, I'd like to, Acts 17, where it shows that Paul has been there day after day, dealing with people, preaching the gospel. And then it says, he uses the word anastasis, which back then, anastasis was the goddess of rising up again. And so at the end there, they say, oh, he's talking about two different deities. No. If you look at the original language, the reason why they thought he was talking about two different deities is because he was using the word anastasis for the rising up again. And so they thought he was talking about the goddess, whereas he was using that to say Jesus rose from the dead, and they thought, oh, he's talking about a masculine and a feminine deity. So you can only see that, with the original language. But overall, yeah, you're right. There are certain things that it doesn't matter. They're going to grasp the general gist of the situation. But yeah, I would agree with that. Well, okay. Well, I don't want to keep you. We've been going for an hour and 19 minutes. I would just say this. Just kind of in closing, and that is that I would wish that you would be a little less polemic. And I don't know if you mean to come off polemic, but you kind of do, to me anyways, and to other people. I mean, I've gotten messages. And I would suggest that if you want to reach people, maybe show a little more compassion. People don't tend to want to listen to somebody who doesn't seem to give a crap about them, but just wants to win an argument. And to me, and to some other people, that appears to be how you come off. I don't know if that's because you're English, or, maybe that's the way you guys communicate, but that seems to be how you come across. And I just want to say that, I'll take what you've said thus to me, as far as my video into consideration, and I just hope that you would take that into consideration, because, after talking to you, I don't think you're as bad as I thought you were. I think you're actually a pretty rational guy, but you kind of came off, especially in text, because you don't do a lot of voice videos. You can't judge the tone and everything, and it really sounds snooty. I mean, don't get me. I don't like saying negative things about people. I really don't. It doesn't make me feel like I'm a bigger person, and because I make them feel smaller. But I do say it to make people better people, hopefully, and I just wanted to say that to you. I think you're a pretty cool guy, and I think if other people could see that, I think you would, you know what I mean? I think people would maybe open up a little bit more, because it's one thing that I think people agree on is sincerity.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. I don't mind you saying that at all. Some of the times I think it's cultural, and I do think that maybe us English don't always understand the Americans, and I don't think always that North Americans understand the English, and so I do think there's an element of that. I think most of the time when I'm writing, I'm trying to write in a way in which I'm being reasonably sincere with people. I think, unfortunately, what happens most of the time on YouTube is you're getting comments from people who don't understand the first thing about what they're talking about.
Right.
They come in and they jump in very aggressively.
Yeah.
And they won't even listen to you. And in that kind of situation, I'm nothing more than a sinful human being who's been redeemed. So I'm nothing more than that, and I'm never claiming to be anything more than that, and I'm certainly not a perfect person, and I'm never claiming to be that. Unfortunately, it's part of my nature just to be very sarcastic in those situations, and that is a trait of the British, and a lot of people take offence at us for that.
Well, maybe if you stop to clarify that.
It doesn't mean to say that you can never change. Of course, that's always the hope, is that you will change and become a better person. But I think sometimes, when you're in that situation, and there's a lot of aggressive.
Do you mind if I ask, how old are you?
Yeah, I'm 38.
Okay, so you're about 7 years older than me.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I agree. There are a lot of very polemic atheists, and I think there's.
I think more than polemic, don't you?
I do. I've actually recently been trying to clean up my act a little bit and be a little more understanding, or at least try to be the bigger person instead of coming back with ridicule, because I get the same thing. I get a lot of nasty. I mean, I just made 2 videos about nasty, angry comments that theists have left, and I've put down something, way to show that the Holy Spirit is working in your life, because if you're what a Christian is, I'm not interested. I've got that on my own. But I am trying to, as I get older now, I am seeing the importance of. I'm more or less seeing it as how infantile it is to have this such testosterone, just like this ownage and ponage mentality. I think it's time to grow out of that. I think it's time to have compassion on people and try to actually reach people instead of talking past them or trying to win an argument. I think that's ridiculous, and anybody can do that. And so I want to make a difference. And I hope that I am, and I hope I will continue to, and I really do, and I hope to reach people, even if we disagree. Shit, at least we can agree to disagree and act like 2 adults. I think that's great.
Yeah, for sure, I agree. One thing I would say about my intention on being on YouTube is really not. I certainly don't have any agenda whatsoever in terms of trying to convince atheists that they should be theists. I don't actually think that YouTube is probably a medium that's ever going to do that in any kind of strong way whatsoever. I think really, all I'm doing on YouTube is hoping that mostly Christians or people sympathetic to Christianity will see the videos and see that Christianity is a rational position to take, and that it doesn't deserve some of the hyperbolic ridicule that especially it's getting in North America. And I think there are reasons for that, for atheists to feel the way they feel in North America. I mean, here in Britain, things are very, very different. You're unusual if you're a Christian in Britain. Right. And secular people, most people in Britain aren't atheists. They don't care. Religion in this country is more or less a completely private thing.
Right.
But in North America, I'm beginning to understand, thanks to YouTube, that actually atheists feel very, very much on the defensive there. And that's very strange to me because, if you come and spend some time in this country, you'll be hard-pressed to find too many Christians. It's the other way around. So I think some of that cultural exchange sort of gets missed between us. But I think this is why a call like this is perhaps helpful. And, I certainly feel like I've seen a different side to you from even watching some of your videos and even listening to some of your podcasts. And believe it or not, I downloaded all 3 of your podcasts that I found on iTunes so far. And just to get brownie points, I have listened to all 3 in their entirety.
Oh, well, I appreciate that.
I'm probably one of very few people who've done that, James. So honestly, I have you on my iTunes, and I'll continue listening.
Don't miss the show.
Talking to you, I would honestly say that I have a lot more respect for you now after this 90 minutes together.
Don't miss the show coming up with Lawrence Krauss, with physicist Lawrence Krauss.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting to listen to. I have a lot of time for him. I sometimes think he's a bit naughty, sticking his atheism in with his physics.
Yeah.
Because there are other physicists who say that he is being a little bit naughty sometimes, but I think if you see him, he often smirks when he's doing that anyway, so I think he's kind of hinting very often when he's doing that. But yeah, I look forward to listening to that. That will be interesting.
Yeah.
When will that be?
Oh, that's going to be on the 2nd.
Okay.
The 2nd of next month. Today is what, the 29th? Okay, so yeah, it's coming up here real soon.
Well, for you, the 28th, but for me, it's now the 29th.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So you think
1 in the morning.
You think the podcasts are a wee bit long, huh?
Well, that's just my suggestion. I think
I've been trying to keep them down to an hour. But
hey, even William Lane Craig keeps his lectures to about an hour.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
After an hour of Craig, I've had enough. So, I think maybe an hour is probably... But that's just my suggestion.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm definitely going to do that from this point on, and it's really a lot of information to upload anyways. Because, I've got to do 2 versions. I got to do the YouTube version, and I got to do the,
Sure.
the MP3 version. So it's, it takes a lot, but...
Yeah.
I am trying to get them down to an hour, and I think it was the 2nd episode. I had a Christian on, and we had a nice conversation. There was no debate.
Yeah.
He was what do you call himself? An agnostic Christian. I think he wasn't really. A lot of people, you probably wouldn't call him a Christian,
No.
but not to go to the no Scotsman fallacy, but but I think. I think
that was a bit weak-willed, I thought.
Yeah, I want you to know.
I wanted someone with a spine.
Yeah, well, here's the thing: is I think I was just kind of getting the feel of podcasting, and I really didn't want to debate somebody. But originally, what happened was this past summer, I called up to Dr. White's show twice, and he sent me back an email saying. Well, I don't have actually posted on the Blogspot site for the podcast, and I posted his whole response, his whole email he sent me, and it basically said, "Get your own podcast." So I was like, kind of like snidely, and I said, "Fine, thanks, Dr. White. That's what I'm going to do." So that's how the podcast got started, And originally it was going to be just debate reviews. I was going to kind of mimic the dividing line, but have it for atheists and kind of go over some of his stuff. And I thought, that's kind of spiteful. And then I just started thinking about it. Let's get some real interesting guests on here. And so that's what I started doing. And I'm actually going to have Dan Barker at some point, I believe, on too. So that'll be interesting. I'd like to get some theists on. If you're ever interested, you want to come on and we could talk about some things or whatever, just shoot me a little message or something.
Yeah, of course I am. And, after our discussion today, I'd be perfectly happy to. The only problem, logistically, for me is that, unfortunately, when you do your show, it's 4 a.m. here. So, if I'm ever going to be on in any kind of capacity, unfortunately, 4 a.m. doesn't really work for me. I need my beauty sleep.
I want to apologize to you for the things I said to you. Yeah, I think there is, because I think that I don't think there's much excuse for that. I think I should try to be the bigger person, even, I think we should all try to. And, I think that, I could have been not returned the ridicule that I at least thought that you were giving me. And
I certainly wasn't to start with, so I'll apologize for giving it later, but it certainly felt very unfair that
I think,
it looked like there was any budging on the time. So
right. Well, I think what happens is that sometimes I don't know if it's because I'm an ex-open air preacher or what it is, and I'm used to dealing with screaming atheists and humanists while being on a stool. But I kind of have this go-get-'em mentality. Like, I get on people's channels sometimes. I'll watch this video and I'll just really like, God, that's such full of crap. Like, I want them to validate their assertion. And I'll read, sometimes I'll leave a message saying, reach me on Skype. Let's debate this. That is total, I just kind of come at them. And it's like, if I were to stop and think about how would that come across to me if I was getting that kind of message. Here's this atheist I don't even know saying, challenge me to a debate on Skype. And I don't always do that, but I think that sometimes I just, like everyone else, at times I get carried away with the emotion and I get really assertive. And that can look kind of, let's say, irrational. But I've been trying to kick that. But there are some, I think, because I'm just, me and David were talking about this. David Funk, he's also he was Anglican Apologist 72. Now he's the Funky Theist. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Me and him are friends on Skype and Facebook, and me and him, we debate back and forth. Just on ontology, and that's our main thing. And we're just, that's the kind of people we are. Whether we're atheist or a Christian, that is what we're going to be, no matter what position we hold. And I think that can be a positive, but it can also be a negative, especially when you're first meeting somebody. You can kind of come across a way that you're not really intending to. So just a really intense, person.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well,
thank you very much for your time. Mm-hmm. I appreciate it.
Definitely, man. Anytime you want to chat, just
speak again sometime.
Sure, no problem.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Thanks, James.
Mm-hmm. Peace.
Okay, then. Bye.
Bye. Well, for those of you who have just been real troopers and, struggled through this podcast from start to, now we're at the finish. I want to appreciate your diligence, your patience. And instead of reading an atheist quote as I usually do, I'm actually going to read a passage from the New Testament. And this comes from, this is Romans chapter 8, verse 30. And I want you to pay close attention, whether you be a theist or a Christian, to the words of this verse. But whom he predestinated, these he also called, and whom he called, these he also justified, but whom he justified, these he also called. Notice how he is doing everything from start to finish.
doesn't seem to be any, this doesn't seem to be a anthropocentric theology here, but a theopocentric theology. And to further validate my claim, I'm going to read you here a couple more verses from the New Testament. This is coming from Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 through 5. According as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, for us to be holy and without blemish before him in love. Notice he does the choosing, and notice he does it with a specific purpose, that specific individuals would be without blemish before him in love. Verse 5, predestinating us to adoption through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. Not our free will, his will. Again, it's a very anthropocentric theology that people have nowadays that is not compatible with the writings of the New Testament. As much as they try to twist verses and take them out of context, when you read them in context, when you look at the original language, you see that the New Testament writers were not anthropocentric, but were theopocentric. So this may offend a lot of people out there, a lot of free willers and all that. I don't really care. I'm an atheist. I'm just telling you what the text of the New Testament says. And if you're a Christian, if you're a theist out there, and you're claiming that this is your holy book and that it is the inspired word of some immaterial mind floating around out there somewhere, whatever the heck that is, if indeed it is, then I'm going to hold you accountable to what your holy book says. Now, Christians, you can quote John 3:16 all you want and say, look, God loves you. See, for God so loved the world, and yeah, look, see, it says right here, he's got a wonderful plan for your life. Well, let me tell you something. You're just ripping that verse out of its context, okay, and misapplying the verse. Let me read you something that most Christians nowadays try to stay clear of. This is from Romans chapter 9. So then, to whom he desires, he has mercy, and to whom he desires, he hardens. You will then say to me, why does he yet find fault? For who has resisted his counsel? Who has resisted the will of God? Paul is saying here. Yes, rather, O man, who are you answering against God? Shall the thing formed say to the one forming it, why did you make me like this? Or does the potter not have right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel to honor and one to dishonor? But if God, desiring to show forth wrath and to make his power known, endured in much long-suffering vessels of wrath, having been fitted out for destruction, and that he make known the riches of his vessels of mercy, which he before predestined or prepared for glory. You see, it says right here, he prepares certain people for damnation, for dishonor, and others for honor, for glorification, for salvation. So, don't come at me with this bull crap about, if, my God exists and he loves you bullshit, because that is not at all what your Bible's saying here. Your Bible is saying that God created people for his purposes. And his purpose, according to this passage and others, is that he created people to glorify himself, some to glorify him in eternal torment, his justice, supposedly, and others, his mercy in heaven. Okay? So that's what's being said here. Deal with the text. Quit trying to twist the text to fit your theology, and just deal with the text at hand. Well, with that said, folks, I got to go now. I'm going to leave you with this song called The Dream by Graydon Square. Please check out Graydon Square's music at graydonsquare.bandcamp.com.
This song is dedicated to all those people throughout human history who've lost their lives in the name of religion. But more specifically, this song is dedicated to all those people throughout human history who've killed in the name of religion. I'm dreaming of a world with no gods at all, no separation, nobody taking sides at all, no Holocaust, no one indoctrinating our children, no religious fanatics flying planes into our buildings, everybody playing in the game of life in which they can't lose instead of killing for an invisible man they can't prove. Nobody dying over a book, no crusades, no war on terror headed by Bush. I'm dreaming of a world where there is no such place as the Bible Belt. Instead of looking up, you look inside yourself, and when you do find yourself, you go help somebody else instead of praying you well to maintain your body's health. Now that's what I call a dream. I'm just glad that I have one like Martin Luther King. Maybe this religion ain't really all that it seems, but it happened. So until it ends, I'ma keep rapping. That's what I call a dream. My dream. Rational response, why? My dream. That's what I call a dream. My dream. That's what I call a dream. I'm dreaming of a world where a young little girl doesn't have to shake her ass after class to get a referral from a boy that she likes and she doesn't like herself, thinking that boy's like would help. Now, I'm dreaming of a world without a religion that tells me that I'm not good enough as soon as I'm born, that I need to be saved from a decision I didn't make, that I need to pay for a piece of fruit that I never ate. I'm dreaming of a better place than a city with roads paved of gold with bigger pearls on the better gates, and it all happens right here, right now, while I'm still rapping, and we keep it nice and tight like gift wrapping. I'm dreaming of a world where God doesn't hate the facts, where manifest destiny says you have to take it back, whatever you stole from whatever race who's owed anything. But mind you, these are my dreams. That's what I call a dream. My dream. Rational response, why? My dream. That's what I call a dream. My dream. That's what I call a dream. My dream is that everybody can see this, where we all carry knowledge around like Rich Rodriguez and Brooke Hawkins. My dream is to be walking with Stephen Hawking right on the beach, talking theory. If y'all can hear me, we can make this come true, instead of wondering what in the hell this world's come to. Instead of fighting wars for religion, we can give praise and make lords of our children. I'm dreaming of a world where nobody is suspect, where rational response members doesn't get death threats. In fact, rational response squad doesn't exist, cause there really is no need for it. My dream is peace and harmony around me, nothing but tranquility and serene surroundings. And that's why you'll get nothing but the best about me, cause all I really want is to make my dreams a reality for real. That's what I call a dream. My dream. Rational response, why? My dream. That's what I call a dream. My dream. That's what I call a dream. Dream. I love you guys. There ain't another group of people out there who I can just sit back and express myself to. And that's what this is really all about. Just getting all this stuff off my chest. You know? You guys are like my own personal therapist. I just get out there, man. Sometimes I'll read a lot of the emails that you guys send me. Man. And how ironic that I would actually use this term, but I feel blessed.